Hey, my name is Chris, and I want to speak into, for a moment, this reality that we're experiencing. Maybe you're aware of it, maybe not, but there's a reckoning happening amongst God's church in the U.S., maybe specifically. And as that's unfolding, I have this metaphor that I learned a little while back that I think speaks to that a bit. And so the idea is this metaphor of dry farming. And my guess is you might not be familiar with dry farming, so let me tell you a little bit about that. What happens in dry farming is that, let's say there's a vineyard, right, that's up on these hills and it's growing. And typically a vineyard is watered by sprinkler systems and irrigation systems, essentially artificial forms of watering the vineyard. Now, dry farming is this concept of removing the artificial watering sources so that the roots might grow deep into the natural watering sources, the living water, if you will. Because what happens as those vineyards are watered by artificial sources, their roots start to ball up. They don't have any reason to grow deep at all. They're here at the surface right here where they can get the artificial water. So the process of dry farming is to actually come up with a plan, a strategy to gradually remove the artificial watering sources so that the roots can begin to grow deep. Well, when a vineyard does that, it takes a handful of years to accomplish. What happens at first as you begin to remove the artificial watering is you lose some of your crop, some of your yield. So it begins to shrink. Over time, it shrinks a little more, but what's happening during that time is the roots are growing deep. And if you want to bury that metaphor in one other thing too, it's the way Paul talks about in Ephesians, that our roots will grow down into God's love. How are our roots growing deep down into God's love in all of this? The ball is untangling itself. So this story about removing the artificial watering sources from the vineyard tells us this thing. First, you lose some. People start questioning why you're doing it. Is this really working? Is it broken? Are they dying? But what's actually happening is your roots are growing down deep. And so there's this one story of this guy who's in Northern California who did this work, and everybody was kind of wondering why he was losing his yield. And in that time, he started to slowly gain it back a couple years later. And as it was growing, an early season rain came. But because his vineyard had grown deep roots, he was able to harvest his fruit. All the other vineyards rotted out because it was just balls. They dried up, they were rotted, they didn't have any fruit on them. So that was one benefit of this roots growing deep, is that when something comes unexpected, which is just the nature of being the people of God, that will happen. Our roots are rooted in a place in which we can actually harvest the fruit that God's been growing. The second thing that happened is that he never yielded an extensive crop, right? It wasn't massive numbers, especially if we're talking about the church. It wasn't the mega crop, if you will, right? What it was actually, it was the finest fruit. It was the best fruit. So ultimately, his vineyard made the best wine, not just some commercial $7 bottle that anybody could get anywhere. It was the finest wine, if you will, which, if you're a Jesus person, Jesus is super down with showing up with the finest wine. And so I think what's happening that we need to pay attention to, we need to first evaluate what are the ways in which we've allowed the church to be artificially watered. How do we begin to remove those sources and invite people back to grow their roots down deep into God's love? What happens there? We get community or communion with God and one another. The change that I think is happening and this metaphor speaks to is that we're going to have to invite people away from spectatorship engagement and into participation in the work of God. That's the challenge. Remove the artificial watering that settles for a version of Christianity where you can just spectate and cheer from the sidelines, and instead get those sources out so our roots grow down deep into God's love so that we might actually be participants in the kingdom of God, the family of God, so that we might grow and become those who bear the finest fruits that produce the finest wines. That's what God intends for us.